And indeed, you know him most likely as Associate Director of the Global Institute for Water Security, Professor in Hydrology here at the University of Saskatchewan, 6th century Chair in Hydrology at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, Honorary Professor at the Nanjing Hydraulic Research Institute, and he's of course known to every one of us for his pioneering work in forest hydrology, tracer hydrology, the two water worlds hypotheses, and so many more things. But for some reason, to my students, he seems to be best known for the invaluable advice to young researchers that he gives through his columns in Science. There's one that I like most, which is called the 1 hour workday, which I think is something we should try and implement ourselves, but maybe perhaps not today. Jeff, I don't know where you are. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Wouter. What I'd like to do briefly is talk about some work in process hydrology at the Hillslope scale. I'm a Hillslope hydrologist, and what I'd like to talk about is how we track raindrops, as it were, or snowmelt from the Hillslope to the stream. And I'll try to acknowledge some of my PhD students and postdocs along the way, but a visual to kind of get us going. So I'll first start with a quick review of Hillslope hydrology from the perspective of connectivity, when things switch on and connect to the stream. And then I'll talk, so that's more of a retrospective look, and then looking forward, how we go perhaps beyond this lateral connectivity and think about where water's going both deep and vertically into the subsurface and then being wicked away by plants and vegetation and some of the future work. So I'll be trying to touch on these topics over the next 15 minutes. And of course, Howard kicked a lot of this off. I didn't mention this last night, but this was the very first time I met Howard. I don't think he remembers the encounter, but this was the IAHS in 1987 in Vancouver. And this really was a pivotal meeting for me. I came away from my field site in New Zealand where I was in the throes of my PhD field work, and Howard presented this paper, Hydrological Flow Paths and Associated Hydrochemistry in a Forested Catchment in Central Scotland. And what was really remarkable was that he had the same tensiometer set up on his Hillslope. He was using this scanny valve system for recording tensiometers, something that had really just been invented by Tim Burt and colleagues at Bristol University. And maybe we were the only two people on the planet using these damn things. It was really a painful piece of apparatus. But Howard and his colleagues produced the most beautiful data. This is, it's tough to see, I know, but on the y-axis, that's matrix potential, and on the x-axis, that's time. And he's showing tensiometers at different depths in the profile and how pore pressure was evolving through an event, and you're getting flashes of positive pore pressure down at the soil-bedrock interface to produce lateral flow, to coax water laterally out of the soil. So this was really pioneering work, and I think two things are really quite noteworthy. One, Howard has gone on to the 10 different themes we see in this program, and I've stayed stuck on this one topic for the last 30 years. So it's really humbling to kind of watch Howard's career progression. So what I want to do is kind of talk about where we're at, and I got kind of obsessed with this and started digging into hillslopes in various areas and trying to test these ideas over the course of about 20 years following this work. And I'll make reference to one or two of these sites. And this is like Frankenstein hydrology. You dig into a hillslope towards the base, remove kind of a soil face to really get an unadulterated look at what's moving laterally at the base of the slope. These could be at road cuts, it could be at various sites in different catchments. And what I found at each and every one of these sites is this. So you're seeing a faint outline of a hill slope, and you're seeing the development of positive pore pressure as a little animation here, and this kind of filling and spilling, creating connectivity, and then water coming out the base of the hill slope. And it wasn't during every event for these various sites, but only certain events. And this really called into question the community's kind of collective view of this development of what we called saturated wedges back then, but the way things had been viewed in my work, Howard's and many others, where you had a fairly planar soil bedrock interface. This topographic relief, as it were, at the soil bedrock interface seemed to have a big effect. And Chris Spence and Hock Woo were looking at this at the kind of more catchment scale and soil-filled valleys even before this. So in my obsession, these red dots are areas where myself and students and postdocs started madly digging and trying to understand the nature of this behavior. And what we found was commonality across all of these sites. Most were Pacific Rim, as you can see, Oregon, where I spent many years, up to Alaska, down to California, and the New Zealand sites, some Japan sites, and then a couple in South Carolina and Georgia. If you look at the bottom, this is representing that irregular soil bedrock interface. This produced this kind of filling, spilling behavior, a precondition for really getting water out the base of the slope. So following this kind of cartoon I'm showing related to connectivity. Once there was connectivity, it produced a threshold-like response where that graph, third one up, is showing flow on the y-axis versus time, really going from the hill slope disconnected from the stream to then connected after a certain threshold. And of course, what we see in the stream, what we're trying to model at the catchment scale, we're blind to this because all we're seeing then is the integrated response in the channel. But this is the trying to unscramble the omelet in terms of understanding these process controls. And in each case, across these very diverse systems, it was filling, loss along the flow path, spilling, connectivity, and a runoff threshold. And if I could communicate to modelers, once you're able to get down to this hill slope scale in your models, we heard about this yesterday, I think Eric's running the world at 30 meters, this is the behavior I would like you to try to preserve at the hill slope scale to get at these dominant processes that I think are important. Now, when I came to the University of Saskatchewan 6 years ago, I was really wondering how I deal with the topographic challenges here on the prairie because I'd worked in steep basins all my life. And one thing really hit me after I got here, and that was the things that I was looking for down at the soil bedrock interface seemed to be expressing themselves right at the surface. And this filling and spilling, once I kind of stood out during enough rainstorms and tried to observe with my students what might be going on, it really seemed like it was the same darn process. And it was a bit of a personal epiphany that what I've been struggling to identify in the subsurface seemed to be going on at the surface. This is some work that came out a couple of weeks ago by Anna Coles, a PhD student, and we see filling and spilling and connectivity on these hill slopes. This is part of the CCRN network, in effect. This is a site at Swift Current, southwest of here. And on these very flat prairie slopes, during these few weeks of activity with snowmelt onto frozen ground, topography on the prairie, you think that's the last thing you'd ever need to consider, and generally it is. At the hill slope scale, when things are frozen, it's all driven by topography and filling and spilling right at that snow-soil interface. So this has been interesting to kind of think about what I find in the end is that really all runoff processes come down to this same set of functions. But of course, all of this focuses on this fairly thin veneer of soil, whether you're at the soil surface or you're focused on the soil bedrock interface. And in the last decade or so, my group's been trying to go beyond this lateral connectivity and think about how this lateral connectivity relates to connectedness deeper down. And what I want to do in my remaining time is to think about what maybe leaks into the deeper subsurface from our hill slopes, and then what is wicked away by vegetation. I'll give you just a couple of examples. We've been developing a backpackable drill rig to get into these headwater catchments that I showed you a map of. These are roadless. They're often quite steep. The photo on the left is the Mai catchment in New Zealand. Slopes are 40 degrees. It's hostile territory. And this is Chris Gabrielli, a recent PhD student, where he's taken our backpack drill rig and we're drilling. You can see the drill string going up to the top of the photo. We're getting down about 10 meters into the bedrock below the soil profile where we've worked for some time. And this has enabled us to explore the nature of bedrock groundwater ups and downs, and we can age date this water. This is work with a group in New Zealand. Beth Jackson and I worked together a couple of years ago. This is Uwe Morgenstern, who's worked with us on age dating these waters. These are wells you're seeing, age on the y-axis, and these are well numbers. We drilled about 40 wells into the bedrock in this 4-hectare headwater catchment, with the objective of seeing whether or not we could determine the age of this bedrock groundwater. You're seeing it's varying from about a couple of years to a little over 20 years. And then with the aid of a 3D model, this is Ali Amelie's work, we've tried to see if the model can reproduce both the head variations and the age of that water. And once we're satisfied that the model's working for the right reasons, now we can go deeper. You're seeing a scale on the y-axis of these plots on the right going down a few hundred meters. And this is trying to track the water molecule beyond the hillslope. And what we're finding with Ali's work is something quite interesting, and that is about half of the water that's falling on these headwater catchments is subsidizing catchments farther down valley, if you account for the water in its entirety as it moves through the system. And I think this downslope subsidy of water is really a big thing. Reed Maxwell had a paper in Science a year ago using his model PARFlow to kind of look at this at larger scales. And subsidy, I think, is something that we've not considered and could be an important factor as it relates to connectivity, when things are connected, and so on. You're seeing some of the flow paths here from Ali's modeling work. Now, if we go deeper, look at this plot here. This is some work of Scott Giuseco, who was a postdoc with me briefly at the Global Institute. Grant Ferguson's also a co-author on this work. The y-axis is showing groundwater now, not just down 300 meters, but this is going down about 600 meters. This is a meta-analysis of literature that we could find on groundwater age dates. This is mostly based on carbon age dating for a whole bunch of sites you're seeing along the x-axis, and there's kind of a map showing where these are in North America and Europe. And what's interesting with these sites, if we look at the age of this water, once you get down below about 200, 250 meters, most of the water, these are pumped wells that Scott was able to access, is fossil water, meaning water older than 10,000 years. And I think when we reflect on the catchments that we're modeling in global water futures and around the world, you know, 250 meters isn't that deep in terms of relief. This is a type of groundwater that we've not brought into our models and is potentially important in the sense that, you know, by definition, the conductivities are very low, storage or movement is slow, but this is bleeding into our streams, and accounting for this in a water security way, I'll try and make a point towards the end, I think is something we should be taking consideration of. Now, in terms of water that goes the other way, we've had some surprises as well recently. When we use these isotope tracers, what we find on the upper right-hand side, this is the International Atomic Energy Agency's suite of rainfall sampling sites for O18 and deuterium. These are tracers of the water molecule that we use in hydrological studies to trace runoff and the fate of water. And if you look at the data from this network, all of these data plot on what's called the meteoric water line. And this is the relationship between deuterium on the y-axis and O18 on the x-axis. And they hug that line, as you can see on the upper right-hand corner. They spread out depending on where you are latitudinally or in terms of altitude. And what we find in our hydrologic studies, like on the left-hand side, is that rain stretches out in blue along that line, and stream water is a lagged and damp version of that. When we start sampling water and vegetation, what we find is rather surprising in the sense that it doesn't follow that same line. The vegetation's following an evaporated line. Anything shallower sloped than that local meteoric water line is a telltale sign of evaporation. The soil water that's retained in the profile undergoes evaporative fractionation, and the plants go after that water. And we can't see that plant water in our stream, and vice versa. So the plants aren't using the water we're seeing in the streams, and the streams aren't showing any evidence that we found yet of the water the plants are using, the so-called two water worlds hypothesis, or ecohydrological separation. This started out with some field studies that we did in Oregon just prior to my arrival at the Institute. One of my recent students, Havame Ivaristo, who's now at Nevada, Reno, tried to test these ideas, again, with a meta-analysis. These are about 50 sites where we had ability to look at these data. The upper plots are showing the mobile water, stretching out along that meteoric water line, the stream water, the groundwater. And the lower two plots in the same kind of meteoric water line plot are showing that the soils are plotting on a shallower slope and the plants are going after that water. And never the twain shall meet. And this is really a puzzle that us and many groups are still struggling to understand in terms of water cycling and how to understand these almost separate pools of water that the vegetation's using relative to what's going to deeper groundwater recharge, for instance. Prior to this, we thought this was one big well-mixed reservoir, and now we're finding this segregation, as it were. Now, getting at the age of the transpired water has been tough because we don't really have the tracer techniques for that. We found a place that we think we can do this. This is on the Lus Plateau in China. Here we have extremely deep sequences of silty soil, and as you know, this is the world's largest afforestation effort on this Lus Plateau, an area larger than France. This is tritium, which is an isotope associated with atmospheric nuclear testing. When we had the comprehensive test ban treaty in 1963, that peak you're seeing in the tritium profile, depth on the y-axis going down about 20 meters here. These are soils data that we've extracted and analyzed for tritium. What we're seeing is a beautiful preserved signal of the atmospheric bomb signal, now shown vertically through this deep, very uniform soil profile. They're growing trees on this, apple trees as it turns out, and these apple trees are sending roots down 12 or 13 meters. So the roots are actually sampling that space where the tritium bulge is located. We've age dated the water in these apples, and the mean age of these waters is 30 years. 30 years. So think about your models. Now, I'm not saying that all transpired water is on that order, but this is starting to suggest that perhaps the ages associated with the water and the water cycle are something we should start to pay attention to if these are at odds with the kind of age estimates, even indirectly, that our models are providing. Now, it's, I think, important at these times like this to recognize your old boss and your new boss. So I want to just end with a quote from Jay. Jay has done some testimony. This was a drought hearing that he did in July 2012, but a quote I'd like to just use to put things into context. I think this is really helpful. How can we manage water for the benefit of mankind in non-stationary times, like Pat told us about yesterday, when we know so little about its various stores, flow paths, residence times, even in a developed country like the United States? And for me, this is really, I think, what speaks to, I think, the importance of process understanding. And sadly, I think this is going the way of the dodo. When I go around and teach short courses, fewer and fewer students are going into the field like Howard did all those years ago. And I think this is a trend we need to counter as much as possible. Why? Because there are fundamental things about the water cycle we simply don't yet understand. So let me try to wrap up. I think in terms of this topic of connectivity, it's really exciting to think how geology and biology control water in our streams. It's exciting to think about how chemistry can help answer these questions. I've just shown some isotope examples, but of course there's base cations and anions and other more exotic tracers, and with our toxicology colleagues here at the university, there's exciting opportunities there as well. And I think the future of this connectivity work really is to think about how, when, why are these compartments connected? Because they are connected. It's just that they're connected very episodically, and going after these questions of how, when, and why, I think, will really help us engage back to the modeling community who require this type of process understanding for models of the future. And I will leave it there. John.
discretize that into the two water worlds, is there exchange between these that we
Yeah.
will see in some environments?
Yeah.
Or is this really macropore
Yeah.
versus micropore discussion?
In a way, I guess it's an artifact of our very rudimentary sampling ability. So for the mobile water, we can use a suction lysimeter, a porous cup device you put in the ground. You hand vacuum it down to 60 inches of mercury, and you get, the water maybe in field capacity on a moisture release curve. The way you get the other water is something called cryogenic extraction. It's a lab technique, and it just gets all the water out down to about 15 megapascals. So in many ways, this is an artifact of our inability to sample discretely along the moisture release curve. And I think if we did that, yeah, it wouldn't be two water worlds. It'll be a multi-world, and we'll use Bayesian mixing models to unscramble that omelet and understand in higher frequency how trees are going after more mobile, less mobile water. We've just done one of these meta-analyses on tree use of groundwater from the available literature, and the use of groundwater is fairly prevalent, but its magnitude is pretty small. But it's suggesting that it's not an either-or. There's various end members trees are going after, and our inability to sample it's really the thing that's preventing further progress.
It'd be interesting to get some of these soils into a CT scanner or something like that.
Yeah.
Start to look at connected versus disconnected portions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's synchrotron here, as you know, and there have been discussions there. There's a nanosim group at LIST in Luxembourg I've spent some sabbatical time at. We've been doing some imaging there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
One more question?
Thanks, Jeff, for just a brilliant presentation.
Thanks, boss.
Yeah. My first act is to give you a raise for the fine work that you're doing. It strikes me just like it did the first time I heard, you mentioned IAEA. The first time I heard Pradeep Agarwal talk about base flow, the age, using the isotope network to look at the age of base flow in streams, and it was decades old. And as a modeler, right, for me, it was a real eye-opener. And so you point to real problems that we have, and I'm speaking about large-scale models. We don't really know the soil depth that well. In our global models, we use depths of, we're getting better, but for a long time in the global community, it's been, 3 meters or something. So you're talking about processes that are critically important, but just, we haven't really gotten to the point of being able to represent them. So it's a real eye-opener. I think it's a challenge for us moving forward to figure out how we can parameterize this stuff. First of all, understand it around the world, but on a large scale, parameterize it, include it in our models, and I think it's very exciting.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, if you're designing a culvert, then maybe this doesn't matter. But if you're interested in how nitrate being applied to agricultural fields is acting like a ticking time bomb, moving to your stream over the course of decades, and even a management practice like turning that loading off won't have an effect for decades to come until that moves through the subsurface. Right, I think that's where this is really has some relevance potentially.